Welcome to the Sharp Way Show. So happy that you are giving me a chunk of your evening. It's a little bit past 7 p.m. on the East Coast, which means you have to watch my mug. Yes, you do. Thank you for joining me this pre-Turkey Day. I do appreciate that. Again, very awesome. If you guys know what we're going to talk about, it's going to be good, because it is going to be good. Then do what you know you have to do, right? You got to give me the like, you got to give me the comment and the share. It's the rules. I don't make those rules up. That's the YouTuber people rules. They make those rules up. So do that so we can get rock and roll on this. I would appreciate it. Let people know we are making this happen. I am very lucky today. I have with me, I'm the editor-in-chief of The Real News, an author of a book, The Work of Living, and an activist for people who are workers across America and across the world. The man himself, Maximillian Alvarez. How are you?
I'm good, brother. Thank you so much for having me on, and happy early Thanksgiving.
There we go. Yes, absolutely. So I know you are a proponent of workers, of labor unions, co-ops, the whole deal. I love that. What I think was special about your book, The Work of Living, is most books about business in general, about people, are going to be about the top dog, right? It's the entrepreneur who fell down, got back up, and now made $1 gazillion, and here's how he did it. Your book isn't that. Your book is about, people who struggle, people who work hard. It's a different, you're centering the worker and not the leader. Why?
Well, I think there's a number of answers to the question. And first, thank you so much for checking out the book. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's called The Work of Living. Working people talk about their lives in the year the world broke. So this is a collection of 10 interviews that I conducted with different working people across the United States at the end of year one of COVID-19. So for everyone watching and listening, just take yourself back to that first year. Think about where we were. I know that so much of the horror of this pandemic, over time became normalized, right? And
Yep.
That's kind of the nature of what we do, right? Human beings adapt. And so,
Yep.
we adapted to a new reality. But even in that first year, right, I could see some things that we were beginning to accept that just days, if not weeks prior, we rebelled against as fundamentally unacceptable. And I knew that the longer things wore on, the easier it was going to be for us to forget everything that we thought and felt and witnessed and did ourselves in those early days of COVID-19, including the incredible sacrifices that working people made to
Yeah.
keep society afloat, right? So in one sense, I wanted to do the book much like I wanted to do or start my podcast, Working People, years ago. And the work and the book very much grew out of the work that I do on that podcast, where I interview workers about their lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles every week. And in fact, in the first or the second month of COVID, I put out a call to folks on social media to send in, testimonies they could record on their
Sure.
phone, on their computers, like just let me know what they were going through. And I was overwhelmed by the response. And in fact, you can still go back on the podcast feed and listen to close to 6 hours of a
Wow.
cool, like 2-part episode of testimonies of folks, janitors, people in the service industry, immunocompromised people, an unhoused person, someone who.
Let me bring this piece up, because this piece I think is amazing. What people don't remember at all is, in the first weeks of the lockdowns and when the pandemic was coming out, people had no idea how harsh or how deadly this disease would be. We didn't know. It could have been Ebola, right? We didn't know what it was going to be.
Yeah.
Clearly now we know that it affected heavily more people who are older with pre-existing conditions, but we didn't know that then. It might have killed young people then. We had no idea whether it was male or female or whatever, or how deadly it would be. But people still, to your point, showed up. They showed up for work not knowing if this was going to be Ebola or affect them at all. They had no idea. And I think it's crazy you bring that up, because for myself, I remember corrections officers, right? You can't close the prison down. Prisoners, they can't go anywhere. They're already home, right? So all of these places are all like stuck together. And then people who are, delivering all the food, right? People who are in hospitals. I mean, you had to make sure that this kept going. And later on, as I think people felt more comfortable after people got vaccinated or people were wearing masks, they felt more comfortable afterwards. But I think your point, that first year, we didn't know this could have been, it could have killed 30 million, right? We didn't know it could have.
Right. Yeah. And I think that it's important to preserve, right, those thoughts and feelings and impressions that we all had at that moment in time. I think about this as a former historian, right? In a former life, I got my PhDs in history and comparative literature at the University of Michigan, thinking a lot always about what did people at the time think about this? How were they dealing with these major historical events, whether those be the Mexican Revolution or World War I or World War II, the Spanish flu, right? And it became very clear to me early on in my studies as a historian, right, how few working people's voices actually were on the historical record. And, that's not an accident. There are a number of reasons for this, depending on what part of the world you're studying and what time period you're studying. But the fact remains is that by and large, it has been our tradition in the ways that we tell history to sort of, privilege the historian as the sort of weaver of the overarching narrative, someone who can distill from that mess of daily reality, like the bigger picture, and put it in a digestible form for people to read.
But also, to my earlier point, though, historians usually pick the top dog. They tell the story. They may tell a story about some worker or some junior person within the world, but they're always going to tell from the top guy's perspective.
Right.
And that's the point that I like what you brought up. It wasn't from the top guy's perspective.
Precisely. And I think that there's actually a really important philosophical point there, right? Because, we call this the great men narrative of history, right? That history is made by great men, whether they be Napoleon or Ford or Elon Musk or this or that president, right? There is a sort of way that we sort of look back onto history. And again, having been conditioned for so long through popular media, through the education that we get in K through 12, right? There's a tendency to sort of believe what historians are telling you, which is that history is made by the powerful, by these kind of larger than life figures, whereas the rest of us just sort of experience history and live through it. And what I wanted to do, as I do say in the introduction to the work of living, is I want to tell history a different way, because it's not just that I wanted to document what working people were going through during this world-changing event of COVID-19, but I was also really trying to make a point, which I think the interviewees make better than I ever could, which is that, in fact, it was working people who helped us collectively survive all of this. Like, as bad as COVID got, I mean, there are just millions and millions of people who are just gone. And I don't think that we've actually really reckoned with that as a society, let alone the people who are dealing with long COVID, the people whose lives have been upended by this pandemic, so on and so forth. The point being
let me grab a couple comments. Okay. Jeff says essential workers were exploited in the early days. Awful. And you bring that up too, right? You talk about the idea that, it was hero pay and then it wasn't hero pay, and it was, we're going to help you out. And then, well, not so much. A lot of that began to happen too. But I want to go one step further. The people you're talking about are really the working class people, because when it comes to the more professional management class, the lockdowns actually weren't that bad for them. Right? I mean, it was bad, but not that bad. If you were wealthy or middle class, right? Or maybe upper middle class, maybe it's a better way of saying it. If you were upper middle, and I live in New York City, so middle class for New York City is different than the rest of the country, right? But if you're in that world, you could go home, work from home, still make money, now not have to, get dressed to go to work anymore, right? So your wardrobe is now less. not have to do dry cleaning. The dry cleaners all over the city went under because no more dry cleaning required. So you actually saved money and spent more time at home. So for some of those people, the lockdowns actually wound up being a benefit. In fact, maybe we may not know this, there was a baby boom in that sector of professional women where they were able to stay home, save some money. Many of them got pregnant. And they were like, hey, if I can stay home with my kid and still make money, it was fine. Meanwhile, the working class women were hammered. I mean, hammered. I feel like there was a class distinction here too, if I'm being clear. And not just the entrepreneur top dog, but even within the workers, I feel like there was a class distinction. Am I wrong on this?
No, I mean, I think that a class analysis is always welcome and, in fact, necessary, because I think there is a lot of truth to what you said. I mean, what I hope comes across in this book and the work that I've continued to do on the Real News and for working people is that we were not all in the same boat, right? And we did not all experience COVID-19
Sure.
the same way. And when I say we, I mean humanity, right? I mean, because if you take what you just laid out in terms of the class divisions within the United States, magnify that across the world. And of course, the most underserved, the countries that have had their economies and resources pillaged over centuries were the ones who were most vulnerable to this deadly disease, and they were the ones who suffered incredibly throughout all of this. So like that sort of class dynamic is very much global, and I think that it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that. But even here within the United States, I think that the one thing to say up front is like there was always going to be a situation like this. Like
Sure.
I think in a sort of like test case scenario, this is where the term essential workers came. Like there were going to be categories of workers who needed to still venture out, go to work. Otherwise, the entire economy and society writ large would collapse. Now, that's basically, like where we started screwing things up, because working people were pushed out into the firing line. Many were sorely underprotected in terms of the PPE that they received.
Sure.
As you mentioned, the hero pay, this is one of the things that I will never get over, frankly, where companies like Amazon were trying to essentially, profit off of the pandemic, which they did handsomely. Think about it.
100%.
Like Amazon's business model, it's like the pandemic was a gift from God to Amazon, because suddenly everyone was ordering everything that they needed. Amazon was hiring like crazy, and as people were losing their jobs, they get funneled into this meat grinder where workers are, ground down to dust and then spat out when their bodies break, making the quotas that Amazon makes them, work towards. But Amazon, and they're not the only ones, but they were out there in the public kind of touting themselves as a caring business and saying, oh, we're going to pay our workers this quote unquote hero pay. And what I always point out to people is there's a very specific reason that companies like Amazon called it hero pay and not hazard pay, because if you call it hazard pay, you have to keep paying it as long as the hazard persists. Like there's actually a legal definition of hazard pay. But if you call it hero pay, it just makes it seem like it's coming out of the benevolence of your own heart, right? But what we saw is like Amazon got like this positive, a PR, which it desperately needed, because before the pandemic hit, we were talking about Amazon workers having to pee in bottles and not go to the bathroom because their time off task was being measured down to the second, right? So Amazon desperately needed this positive PR. It got it, but then no one made a peep when Amazon just ripped that hero pay away from its workers, even though they continued to go in and sacrifice. And in fact, this is like connected to the story of where the organized labor kind of wave has come from. Chris Smalls at the Amazon labor,
I remember.
He got fired for protesting the COVID safety protocols at his warehouse on Staten Island. So
that's my city. I know. Absolutely. Yes. But isn't that right? By the way, for those of you who want to know more about what Maximillian is doing here, head over to therealnews.com. It's in the description, or follow him on Twitter. It's Maximillian _ALV. For those of you listening, Maximillian, and that's 2 L's in Maximillian, for those of you who are listening, _ALV to check him out, or therealnews.com. But I think that there's a silver lining in this, right? I feel like because of this, that's one of the reasons why you see a bigger push for unions in the private sector. I mean, the private sector unions have been devastated in the last 40 years or whatever. I mean, decades, whatever number of years, devastated. Public unions doing fine, particularly in New York State. Public unions doing great. But private unions have been getting hammered for a long time. So, and in fact, most of the image that most people have of union workers here in New York State is, oh, if it's not a government job, it's a government funded job, like government funded contractors and stuff like that. That's the image. But when people started fighting in Starbucks and fighting in Amazon, I feel like the image changed. I think Smalls was, I guess, one of those workers that became bigger than life in many ways, because I feel it changed the image of unions. And I don't think you get that without COVID. So I think there is, as bad as the lockdowns were, I think there is a silver lining. Am I off on this?
I don't think that you are. I think there's actually a lot to unpack there. Because I guess picking up from where I was going before, this is something that I talk about in the book. I do think that a lot of the labor struggle that we're seeing, this kind of revitalized labor movement, we don't want to kind of oversell that, because as you said, the organized labor movement in this country has been on a steady decline for over half a century. I mean, union density in this country reached its height, I think, around the late 40s, when it was around 30%. Now it's barely hovering around 10%, meaning only 10% of the workforce, the actively employed workforce in the United States, is represented by a union. And the numbers, as you mentioned, have been abysmal in the private sector, right? And so we are a far cry from, the heyday of American labor around World War II. And so when we talk about a revitalization of the labor movement, right, that means that it has a heartbeat once for the first time in a long time, seemingly. I don't want to give short shrift to the struggles that have happened in between, but those have been very far and few between.
Yeah, but I was alive in the 80s, right? I was active in the 80s. My age, I mean, I was of working age in the early 80s. That's when I began working. And the image of unions was not good. Like the Reagan years, it was not a good look. Oh, union, you guys are lazy guys who don't want to work. That's what it was like. The image was not good.
Yeah.
And I feel like that image has changed since. And this is just me, right? I have no data on this, Maximilian, so I could be completely full of crap. I have no data on this. This is just my emotion, my feeling that I see around New York City, that the image is changing of what a unionized worker is. There were so many jokes, and if you go to New York City, the union worker, it's 4 guys standing around a hole and 1 guy digging and 3 watching, and that's the union guy, right? They don't work. That was the image of it. But now when we see to your point, there's no one who thinks Amazon treats their people well, right? That's not a thing anymore, right? So now I feel like, again, as bad as it was, that image is the spark, I believe, to get people going, oh, we should care about unions. Oh, yeah. I've forgotten about that, because for years I thought I could just make my millions on Wall Street. Well, maybe I should care about unions now.
So I think that the last point that you said is crucial, because I grew up with everything that you just said, right? I mean, I've been very open on my show, on other interviews, that I grew up very conservative in a Mexican-American household. The first person my dad voted for when he became a citizen was Ronald Reagan. And he grew up in a lean-to shack in Tijuana, right? I mean, but he very much believed in that American dream. And he was very much, and my mom and so many others in our family were caught up in that sense that unions as such may have served an essential historical purpose in the past, but they were outdated now. Now, as it seems that the Cold War is coming to an end and capitalism is emerging triumphant on the global stage, the pie is going to be bigger. There's going to be a bigger piece for it for everyone. If you just put your head down and work hard, you get a good education. That was the sort of social contract that was made in the Reagan era. I do think that you're right that the sort of changing image of what a union is and who union workers are has
Mhm.
been an essential ingredient to that. That includes Chris Smalls, also includes the largely Gen Z, a lot of like queer people and women, and just the non-traditional,
Mhm.
roughneck blue collar worker who are leading the movement in the Starbucks union wave and stuff like that. So that is a big part of it. But I think an even bigger part, and this is well, also what I would say, the data that you're looking for, one thing we can hang our hat on is that public favorability of unions is at like a 50-year high right now,
There we
according
go.
to
Okay.
recent polls. So
So
people,
it's
the
not
public,
just me.
no, the public is
Okay.
definitely more in favor of unions than they have been in my entire lifetime. So that is a phenomenon that is happening. But I think that, to your point, one of the deeper structural reasons for that is, like you said, like the sort of image, the negative image that people had of unions in the 80s. We don't have to go into a whole history lesson
Mhm.
there, but from that point in the 1980s, you can Google these, the graphs are all over the place. Look at like the Economic Policy Institute and so on and so forth. What you see from 1980 onwards is like an even steeper decline in union density over the past 40 years, right,
Mhm.
to the point where we're barely hovering around 10% now. At the same time, you see that American workers have been working longer and harder and have been more productive
Mhm.
than ever before. What you also see is that wages over that 40-year period for the average worker have remained largely stagnant.
Right.
What you
Yep.
also see in that 40-year period is the cost of living keeps going up. But what you also see in that 40-year period is all of that excess productivity that workers have been generating by working longer, working harder,
Mhm.
under the promise that they would get a bigger share of the pie. They have not. All of that extra profit, or almost all of it, has gone to the top like 1%. It's gone to executives, it's gone to shareholders, it's gone to the people at the top. So what we have seen over 40 years is not just that, unions are maybe good in general, but also that the corporate class lied their butts off, and the politicians who bought into this sort of trickle down BS, we've seen that it was all a fiction. What in fact came of it is that the rich got richer while the
Mhm.
rest of us worked harder, longer, and were more productive, and we are struggling more and more to make a living. This was even before the financial crash of
Right.
2007.
Mhm.
So things have really that's been the direction for workers. At the same time, corporate consolidation has been on
Sure.
steroids. And like, just as consumers, the world that we inhabit has been like less and less satisfactory. The quality of services is going down. That is not an accident. That is a widespread phenomenon that
So hold
comes.
on. If that's true, right? And I think you're right. If that's true now, then that kind of tells me that even if I get my union to give me better rights, if I get my union to give me higher pay, if I get my union to do the thing that I want to do, the American dream isn't going to get me to where I can, but the TV show or the movie where I go in the mailroom, right? And then I have the great idea and the boss sees me and I become the VP of sales, right? The old 80s, 90s movie of every guy goes in that way and comes out and becomes a CEO in 5 years or whatever the case may be. If that moving up piece is not real, maybe unions aren't the answer. Maybe the answer is more co-ops, to where I now am part of the ownership class, or more freelance work where I can choose my own path, or I can be the boss if I want to, where my work is literally directly for me. Is that maybe a better way in today's world than going the union route?
Well, it's a fascinating question, because if I was still in academia, I would say, oh, now we're talking like socialist history, like history, right? Because
Sure.
that was the whole ideology of the Soviet Union, right? Is that like you need state socialism as a transitionary period from capitalism to communism. We just never got to full communism, right? So I mentioned that kind of tongue
But
in
but no, no,
cheek.
you can have co-ops. You could have co-ops without socialism. You could have voluntary co-ops, right? There was a plan that I had when I was running for governor. And I was talking about this idea that if the state owes you money for whatever reason, right? Whether it owes you money for unemployment, whether it owes you money for settlement, the state owes you money. if you can get at least 5 people together, you could get a credit union, basically co-op banking, a local credit union to support a business plan. The state will give you that money up front so you can start your own co-op. That's voluntary. It's no extra taxation. There's no socialism involved. It's voluntary. You guys together get together and go, I'm going to start a co-op. Because I think most people right now believe, not that true. Most bankers, let me be clear on that. Most bankers now think co-ops can't work. They believe it to be true.
Correct.
I think we have to have a world that shows co-ops can work. So bankers go, wait a minute, these credit unions are making money on these co-op businesses. I want in. And then they see the value and they do it. So I think you can do it without socialism. Am I wrong on this?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you call it, right? I mean, because I want to be clear. What the reason I brought up the Soviet Union example was just to say, like, that state socialism was meant to be a transitionary period. So what I would say is that in that vein, perhaps you could argue that unions are a transitionary form of democratic grassroots worker power on the way to having full-fledged democratic cooperative ownership by workers,
got it.
In the economic sphere. That would be an interesting discussion to have. But, again, I think we're far away from that. I think
hold on, I want to be clear on this so my audience understands. You're saying that unions could be, in theory, that's that step from unionized work into worker ownership, right? That could be a transition is what you're saying.
It could be. I mean, because... And to people watching and listening, like all I'm saying is that the labor movement as such and unions as a, distinctive historical form of worker organization, what that is the manifestation of the principle of democracy translated into the workplace. We live supposedly, in the greatest democracy the world has ever seen. And yet, for the vast majority of us, the very notion of democracy stops the moment you clock into work, right? Then you go into an authoritarian regime. It is a supremely hierarchical arrangement where you are told what to do, when to do it. You are penalized for doing anything out of line, so on and so forth. You're paid accordingly, yada, yada, yada. And this goes back to the conversation we were having before and why I think COVID played such a pivotal role in the labor activation and mobilization that we're seeing right now is because the same workers who were literally holding society up while bosses and executives and shareholders were, like playing board games in their second or third homes, right? We saw
totally accurate.
We saw who it was who actually makes this world run. It was working class people. It was we who held us together. It was not the rich and powerful. And yet, after, kind of doing that, after showing that, after making those sorts of sacrifices, working people were, called essential in the media. They were called essential by their bosses. But what we realized, and what so many workers have told me, is that this system revealed to us that it values our labor as essential, but it does not value our lives as essential. Our lives are expendable. Like, that's what I mean. And that's another reason why I did this book behind me, is because I wanted to preserve and show for people that every single life that was lost was a full human being with a long backstory and a complex life, and someone who, is just gone, and someone, whose family is going to have to deal with that loss as we carry on into the 21st century. And that is sacred. Like, that is something that we should not just sort of gloss over as another statistic on a spreadsheet. These are flesh and blood human beings. These were fellow parishioners. These were t-ball coaches. These were co-workers who are now dead. And just to finish the point.
Go ahead, please.
Is working people during COVID-19 were subjected to unilateral top-down decisions, very consequential decisions that were made that impacted their livelihoods, their lives, and their safety. Just like in Amazon, when a company like Amazon just says, this is our COVID safety policy, everyone just has to live with it, more and more workers were saying to themselves, well, why don't we have a say in this, right? And so they said, we as the workers who make this business run should have at least a seat at the table, and we should have a say in how these decisions are made. That is what I mean when I say that unions are the translation of democracy into the realm of the workplace. Now, to your point, that still maintains the hierarchical structure where you have a boss on one side, workers on the other. The workers are just actually working together. If you have a cooperative, in theory, you take away the boss, you make all the workers like a cooperative boss, and the decisions are made democratically. And in fact, we did a great series at The Real News that
Well,
my
hold on. No,
colleague.
you could still have a boss as long as the boss is voted on.
Yeah,
right?
that works too. Like they're kind of
You
rotating
can still have that.
positions and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah, once again, like just infusing more democracy into a place where democracy is barren in this country. And we actually did a great series at The Real News that was produced by my colleague Jessel Knorr, brilliant journalist, which was on how did worker cooperatives fare during COVID-19. And he looked at one in New York. There's a great cooperative that is a home health aid cooperative. He looked at one that's like a laundry service in Cleveland, a food service in Chicago, Red Emma's bookstore here in Baltimore. And what we saw through those investigations is that in fact, worker cooperatives did fare pretty well economically, and they actually, prioritized worker safety in their decision-making process. That's not to say there aren't severe limitations. You named one of them. It's actually really hard if you want to start a worker cooperative to get a loan, right? There are services available, but it's made deliberately
very hard
for people to actually do that.
Most of my consulting is in either law, tech, or finance. And I know the finance world, they do not think co-ops work well. And I would say your point, we have to have more examples so that people go, oh, you know what? They might work too. I can roll the dice on them as any other one. Well, you have a fan here. Cody Code says, this guy is smart. What's his name? So there we go. His name is Maximillian Alvarez. You can follow him if you want to on Twitter at Maximillian_ALV. He wrote the book, The Work of Living. You can check that out on therealnews.com if you want. I have a couple more comments if I can grab one. This is Brian was a good point. He says, by lobbying the government to do those things that they used to do, have they made themselves largely relevant? And this is a point that I bring up often, right? And let me give an example of this where it actually fights. Here in New York State, we passed family medical leave, right, in New York State, which most workers would say, oh, that's a great thing, right? Most workers would like that idea, but there's a problem with it. And the problem is we have a lot of unions in New York State, and the unions have already made deals, right, to do the work. So in many places, particularly manufacturing, some of our agricultural areas where we have unionized workers, the people have said, look, I need you to work on the weekends. I need you to work during the holidays. So how do we negotiate this? And the unions have come and said, yes, we will do it, but you got to pay us this, you got to give us that, blah, 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 and we'll do it. And they agree. So now the workers are working, they're getting time and a half or whatever is the deal they've made. Well, now here comes government saying Family Medical Leave Act. You have to get paid for whenever you decide to leave. So people who are unions are leaving, walking away, going, oh, I'm going to leave for a week to go on family medical leave. And you now have to pay me the special price that I was supposed to get paid only if I'm doing the work, but I'm not. And they began to fight each other. And you found now employers are like, what's going on here? But the other part of that is, if the government's doing what the union's supposed to do, am I making the union irrelevant? Should I just have government say everyone gets X? Or my worry about that line, which many people are pushing, is where does the worker co-op piece come in? I feel you're almost destroying that. And then you're making it to where it's basically, if government runs everything, government is still run by the elites. Elites will run everything. I went long on that, but you see my point. My point is, if government's doing so much, is it hurting unions or the reverse?
Excellent question. And I just want to thank people for watching. I hope that we're providing y'all with a interesting conversation, and really love the comments and questions. I think this one is really important, right? Because this is, I think, a mistake that many unions made, and to their credit, I think that a lot of them didn't necessarily have a choice in the past. I'll explain what I mean. One of the most prominent examples of what we're talking about here is healthcare. One of the things that unionized workers really can hold up, like over non-unionized workers traditionally, is better healthcare plans, right?
Yeah, very true.
And
in New York, that's true. 100%.
Very true and very important. Now, like, that is not an excuse for saying you don't deserve health care if you're not in a union. I think that's wrong. I think that we need, like, you know, a single payer, something like Medicare or healthcare is is a human right, and everyone should have it. Now, imagine how much more power workers would have at the bargaining table if they didn't have their freaking healthcare and the healthcare of their families dangled over them every time negotiations come up. That is such a powerful force that the bosses have. It's a card they have in their pocket where they say, like, you know, like, we can threaten your health care, and that's going to make you back off on wanting higher wages or not wanting to work 10 hours a day, so on and so forth. So in fact, I think that it would benefit all workers, not just union workers, for us to acknowledge as a society that healthcare is a human right. Everyone should have it. It's weird and creepy and bad to have my personal healthcare or the needs of my family in the hands of my employer. Like, if you stop and think about that for a second, it's actually like really bad system that we should do away with. I don't think that makes unions irrelevant. I think it's a really interesting question. I would actually argue the opposite. I would say that that means that we can actually advance as a working class. That means that working people can actually start fighting to gain more ground instead of being in the sort of a defensive posture that they have been in for the past 40 years, largely just trying to hold on to what they have, and in fact losing a lot of that stuff through concessionary bargaining periods. So I think that actually, if you take some of these things out and guarantee them to all workers, that is actually really essential for working people in general. And I want to say just one thing about the New York City example, because again, I grew up conservative. Like, I really used to think a lot of these same things, and so I very much sympathize with the questions that are being asked. And I think that a conclusion that I've come to is that I would much rather deal with a society in which we have problems within the labor movement to fix than to not have a labor movement, right? Because we have seen what society looks like when the bosses and the rich and Wall Street have largely unchecked power to shape the world the way that they see fit, without having that one force, which was the labor movement. The labor movement, as imperfect as it has always been, was at least a force that the bosses and politicians feared. Up until a point, they feared that constituency because they could go on strike, and they had numbers to do that. They also had a lot of public support around the mid-century, so you didn't want to cross picket lines or fire strikers or stuff. At the same time, you know, they also formed voting blocks that politicians should have had to fight over, and
but
so
hold on,
on.
I got to touch this piece here. Right? This is an important piece, because what you're saying now is, back in those days, America was basically a monopoly then, right? After World War II, we blew up most of Europe and Asia. If we didn't blow it up, someone else did. Most of Europe and Asia was blown up. Africa wasn't really a competitor for us. We were kind of a monopoly across the world in general. So if we're going to go back to that world, aren't we going to put ourselves in the place to where globalism basically destroys us, right? To where the argument that we hear all the time is, well, I can't pay you guys so much because then I'll just do the work in China, or I'll do the work in Eastern Europe, or I'll do the work in Southeast Asia, or whatever. Don't those two things fight each other, or no?
Again, this is why I think it's a great question. I think, yeah, they do, but like, globalization was inevitable the way in a capitalist society. Capital was always going to realize that if it stayed landlocked and played by national rules, it was eventually going to reach more of a, you know, homeostasis, right? Inequality was going to lessen. Profits were this is one of Marx's greatest insight, right? The rate of profit was going to fall. So what did they do? They, like, neoliberalism kicked down the door, deregulation happened, deindustrialization happened, globalization happened, and as you said, you know, corporation after corporation learned that they could just go abroad and exploit workers in other countries and pay them way less, take advantage of fewer worker rights and protections, environmental regulations, so on and so forth, and just pocket the difference. They were still making all those profits. They were just pocketing the difference, and working people in the United States and around the world suffered because of it. Now, the problem is seeing our fellow workers in other countries as somehow the enemy in that scenario. They are not. Working people who are being exploited in maquiladoras south of the border are not your enemy. Working people in China or India or Africa are not your enemy. The people.
But wait a minute, but isn't this going directly against what the vast majority of humanity feels, right? I'm not saying you're incorrect. What I'm saying is, isn't this going against something like, I mean, we believe, doesn't it feel like, let me say that, doesn't it feel like it's a zero-sum game? If the jobs are going overseas to Mexico or to Poland or to China, well, then the job isn't here, right? There's only X amount of jobs. If the guy is making the thing in China or making the thing in Korea or making the thing in Poland or making it in, Mexico, then it's not being made here. So isn't he my enemy because he's taking my job, right?
No, he's not. He's not taking your job. The capitalist is taking your job and taking it somewhere else where you don't have access to it. The guy who's trying to support his family, he doesn't have a say in that. And yet this is what we tend to do. We tend to punch sideways or downwards and leave the people who are actually responsible or most responsible for our collective misery untouched. And this goes back to the point of the labor movement, as imperfect as it was, at least it was a backstop. It was at least a force that bosses and politicians felt they had to contend with. And as that has evaporated, they have not had any checks on their power, which is how we've ended up with the situation that we're ended up with today, right? And so that's what I mean when I say I would rather us have to deal with the problems of a labor movement that needs an update or a house cleaning or more democracy in unions, which is happening. Last year there was an incredible referendum held by the United Auto Workers so that union members could directly elect their union leadership the way the Teamsters were forced to do after all the corruption scandal with Hoffa, so on and so forth. It's wild to think that the UAW, as large as it was or is, did not have direct democratic elections for their union leadership. But that's why you saw things like the John Deere strike this time last year, 10,000 workers at a major manufacturing plant. So there are still a lot of manufacturing jobs here. You had 10,000 of them on strike last year. And you had the international leadership strongly recommend that the rank and file accept 2 tentative agreements that the rank and file voted down by like over 90%. And so what you see there is a very big divide between the rank and file and the union leadership. And that is why you need more democracy in that union, because we all know the problems with corruption in unions. The UAW is, got investigated by the feds. Everyone knows that. That doesn't mean that unions should just be thrown out with the bathwater. That means those assholes need to get out, and workers in the rank and file need to have more of a democratic say in their unions, just like workers need to have more of a democratic say in their workplace. Because if you don't have that, if you don't have any sort of collective organization where workers can band together and express their needs and actually fight for what they deserve in the workplace, we are all at the mercy or lack thereof of bosses. In many states in this country, you could still be fired just for looking at the boss funny, right? I mean, workers have so few, actual rights in this country. We say they have rights, but in a day-to-day reality, most people don't. You still get bullied at work. You still get harassed at work. You can still get fired for flimsy reasons. Starbucks is doing it left and right now. Everyone knows Starbucks is breaking the law, and Starbucks itself knows it's breaking the law, but it knows how slowly the law moves, and what it's trying to do is demoralize and all of these Starbucks workers to the point that they stop trying to unionize. And that is what I worry about, is that it's working.
So what you're really asking for, or I should say maybe advocating for, maybe is a better phrase, is not necessarily a union or not, but you're asking for more democracy in the workplace, whether that's through co-op, whether that's through union, whether that's through whatever the case may be, people having more say. You're more concerned about the elites, whether they be union elites, political elites, or economic elites, entrepreneurial elites. You're worried that the elites are exploiting the workers regardless.
I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, I think that in any system, whether it be a socialist system like in the Soviet Union or a capitalist system like in the United States, whether it be in a union or whether it be in a non-unionized workplace, whether it be in a police department or a fire department, power structure in which the people at the top are unaccountable to the people at the bottom is a power structure that is going to be taken advantage of and that is going to be abused by people. That is, again, I'm speaking like just, as a historian,
Sure.
that is a historical truth. If you have these power structures that can be captured from the top and there's no democratic accountability, people are going to take advantage of it. They're going to use tyrannical force to maintain and wield that power. It is a bad situation. So yes, we absolutely need more democracy in all forms. I agree. And sorry, just the before I forget, because I know we're going to move on. The last thing I would say to people about why it's important to still have unions and have a labor movement, even if they're imperfect versus not. New York City is a great example. I was there a couple months ago and I did an interview with the great folks at Labor's Local 79. Their office is downtown next to Madison Square Garden. They do great work, a lot of demolition work, construction work in the city. Those are unionized workers. Now, I was interviewing at their headquarters non-union, undocumented workers who work for the demolition company Alba, a notoriously anti-union company, a company that is also notorious for cutting corners and putting workers in danger. Now, you may have problems with unions. I get that. Who doesn't, right? I mean, but again, what I'm saying is that those problems are better to have than no unions at all, because the workers who work for places like Alba can tell you so. If you work for a union, you have contracts in place, you have regulations, you have safety protocols, you have training, you have people doing dangerous work, but they're doing it the right way. They have supervision, they have people with them. At places like Alba, you don't have that. You have like undocumented workers, or maybe they are citizens, but they are being taken advantage of. Maybe they are returning citizens. Maybe they were incarcerated before that. There are videos of Alba demolition workers removing asbestos, being told to remove asbestos and just put it in bags and throw it in the back of a truck. That is not how you are supposed to remove or dispose of asbestos. That is putting workers at hazard. That is putting anyone passing by that work site at hazard. So that is what we're talking about. We're talking about.
I get you. I get you.
Okay.
All right. Look, you made it. Sarah's happy. She says, "Evening, Larry. Thanks for your honesty, dedication, and informative content." Well, look at that. We're doing something right. You give me such hope for the LP. I appreciate that. Yes, absolutely. So let me grab a couple there. There's a bunch of comments. I think that some of them come kind of close to what you were talking about. Let me see if I can grab a couple that are more in that world. Let's see here. Alexander says, "I support private sector unions, but I'm against public sector unions. When public sector unions bargain for higher wages, it means less taxes for other priorities and higher taxes for all of us. Can Max opine on this?" I mean, I think he's got a valid worry, right? I mean, the worry I have with this one is that I feel like when it's a public sector union, sometimes it's not really this, right? In a private sector union, it's obviously this, right? It is if I'm the boss, it's my money coming out of my pocket to get you to work harder for me, whatever. It's that. I feel like public sector is almost like, how can I bribe you guys for votes? That's almost how I feel when it comes to public. I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. What's your view on his issue between public and private sector unions?
So let me opine. And really appreciate the question. And I would also preface this by saying, like, there are great people out there who have addressed this question and could address it in greater depth than I could. I would point folks to the Valley Labor Report, Alabama's only weekly radio talk, pro-union radio talk show, which is co-hosted by the great Jacob Morrison, who himself is a government worker and he's also a shop steward. He talks about this a lot, and he'll fully admit the problems with government employed public sector workers and their unions, but he will also, I think, make a very convincing argument for why we need to improve them, not get rid of them, so on and so forth. I think that those concerns make sense. I think this is a real test case for us to see whether or not we learn the lessons of our own history. I was in Wisconsin last summer. Not this past summer, but the one before. And I was filming for The Real News and a collaboration with In These Times magazine. And a big part of why we were there to shoot was to look at what the state of public sector workers and public sector unions was 10 years after the passage of Act 10 under Republican Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin. We hopefully all remember the Wisconsin uprisings in 2011. And the biggest public demonstrations in the state history, one of the biggest in the country's history, and it failed, right? Walker got what he wanted. He eviscerated public sector unions. He not only, there's so many ways that he just took a sledgehammer to public sector unions in the immediate term in 2011, and also in the long term. He put in a lot of provisions that were meant to essentially bleed unions dry, like they have to go through recertification votes every year. There are a lot of stipulations that make it very hard to cross the 50% threshold to keep your union, yada, yada, yada. Then, of course, Wisconsin went right to work a few years later, which made it even harder for unions to, do what they're supposed to do, which is represent their members. If you're being bled dry, if you can't collect union dues and you're being asked to do the same amount of work, you're not going to be able to do it. There's an important
piece here, though, right? If this is public sector, and I don't know the answer to this question, so maybe you don't either, but did the actual people of Wisconsin get more bang for their buck after he did it?
No.
If they still got good schools or whatever, if they still got the better outcome, then good, right? I mean, this is a public sector. This isn't a private company. This is our taxpayer dollars. So if he trashes the joint, but they get still good schools and whatever, they trash it. Your public sector, right? Or am I wrong?
No, you're right. And the answer to that question is no. And there is data.
There we go.
Again, watch the work that I did. Listen to the folks that I talked to who, again, have way more expertise on this than I do, but it's all up there at the Real News. Sadly, the answer is no, right? But the reason I bring up the Wisconsin example is because 10 years ago or 11 years ago, remember, we were still in the kind of, waves of a recession. My family was losing everything. We lost our house. I was working at a warehouse in California at this time, 11 years ago. It was in that moment that Scott Walker and the Republicans were able to turn a public that had hurt from a recession, a public that had very legitimate concerns about where its tax dollars were going and how much people were spending and being asked to spend when everyone was hurting. That's totally legitimate. And what Walker did expertly is what we were talking about before. He got people to punch sideways or down, or to perceive that they were punching up at these cushy union workers who were getting a better deal than they were and were siphoning off all of, the tax revenue, so on and so forth, of the state. Unfortunately, the results show a pretty dismal picture, right? I've talked to a bunch of K through 12 educators in Wisconsin, and what they say is we are hemorrhaging teachers because they're getting paid less. So they're going to other states, which means the teachers that are here are getting higher class workloads and thus delivering lower quality of teaching. So if you want to talk about, well, did Walker's plan work out for public education? No, it screwed it. It also took a hammer blow to one of the greatest public institutions in the United States, which was the University of Wisconsin system. I remember I got accepted to a PhD program at UW-Madison, and all the professors there in 2012, 2013 said, don't come here. We don't know what's going to happen. People's pensions are being lost. Layoffs are happening. The quality of the education, I can't guarantee it the way that I could. Now, I'm not saying that it's been bedlam, right? I mean, again, working people make the best with what they have. Wisconsin still has a lot of great parts about it and a lot of amazing people, whether they're unionized or not, fighting for their rights, fighting to improve their workplaces. But the point is that Act 10 and then right to work made it significantly harder for working people to actually do that and to, get the wage gains that they needed, get the kind of better healthcare benefits that they needed, so on and so forth. And the last thing I would say is, when I say we should learn the lessons of history, is that was a textbook case of divide and conquer. That was let's pit non-union workers against union workers. Let's paint this picture of the public sector worker as this kind of fat cat who's just siphoning off all of our tax dollars and getting things that I don't get. That is the trap that they have set for us every year. If a public sector worker has better,
right? The problem that we have here, though, is I see where you're going. but I look at my own state.
Yep.
And what I see is teachers who are disrespected in general, which sucks and I can't stand it. But to be fair, in New York State, teachers are paid a living wage. That in New York State, it's a living wage. They're not, millionaires, right? They're not buying new cars every year, but it's a living wage. The average teacher in New York State makes about $70,000 to $80,000 a year, skewed by New York City. So that's a living wage if you are a teacher, right? You're not starving. However, our administrators make $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. That is where I see the bloat, and those are hired. And those are the people, those are the educators. When I hear educator, I don't think teacher. When I hear educator, I think administrator who's full of crap, who's sucking all my taxpayer dollars. That's what I hear, right? When I hear educator, I hear teacher, I go, oh, good. You're helping the kids. You're making stuff happen. Well done, teacher. That's what I think. When I hear educator, I think administrator who's talking a bunch of trash and makes $300,000 to do virtually nothing. And if the person stopped coming to work tomorrow, nobody would notice. That's where my head is. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I think there is a chunk of that bureaucracy that is supported by the union that makes, particularly New Yorkers, but I would assume other state people too, just want to throw up and say, why are we paying for this person or these people when what I care about is the teacher that's in front of my kid, right? I care about teacher in front of my kid. Why do we still have all these people? This is all the fault of the union. Now, I'm not saying it is, but this is the emotion. It's all the fault of the union supporting these bloated, bad people. They're not supporting me. And this goes to Shelley's point. Shelley says, I'm in favor of real unions where the members make the decisions. I've been in 3 unions who never spoke for me. That is a common problem where unions are literally taking 90% of their effort and focusing on 10% of the bad apples, while the 90% of the good apples get virtually no support. So I feel that's a big chunk we have, particularly in public sector, and I don't know how we repair that.
So I think we got to roll up our sleeves and we got to do it ourselves. Frankly, I think, again, the answer is not, destroy unions, throw the baby out with the bathwater. The answer is run for election. This is what the Chicago Teachers Union did 15 years ago. The whole reason the Chicago's teacher union took on Rahm Emanuel and waged one of the most significant strikes in, the past half century was first because they felt the exact same way that you guys are all feeling about unions right now. And they said, hey, the people that we have elected to lead us aren't doing crap. I mean, I don't know if I can swear on this. I've been not swearing, but they're not doing shit, right? They're just sitting there and taking whatever, the school board wants to give because they're getting, paid handsomely. Like, they're fine. They don't give a crap about the membership. And so you had a reform slate, sweep them out. And then that reform slate, once they got in, they focused on grassroots organizing, getting members engaged, working with the community, actually figuring out what their collective needs were and how they could win, what they needed in the classroom and what their students needed as well, right? And that's what they were able to do. And I think that really set the precedent for the next decade, which we saw in the Red for Ed strikes, right? Which we've seen in the kind of recent strike wave as well. Like I mentioned, the John Deere one, that was also a sort of revolt against the union leadership because the members were saying, look, the deal that you guys worked out at the table that we didn't really get a say on, we get a say now. And we're saying this deal is crap. And we're going to stay out on the line until we get a better one. So you can fight. And I think we have to stay and fight. And I think that what is so exciting about this moment is that so many workers are doing what I never thought to do when I was working in service or in warehouses or, in retail. If my job sucked, I either just, grinned and bared it because I knew how much I needed the job and I
gotta pay your bills.
Gotta pay the bills, right? Or if I had the opportunity, I left and I got a different job. Maybe it wasn't a better one, but at least it was a different one. Those are the only 2 options that I felt I ever had. I think it's really remarkable that more working people in this country, in the service industry, in healthcare, in education, in manufacturing are saying, no, I'm not going to leave. It disrupts my life to leave. And also, I like my coworkers. I actually like the work that I do, but I hate that we're exploited. I hate that we're not paid enough. I hate that we're made to work overtime, and we never get to see our families. And so instead of just leave this terrible situation for some poor sucker who's going to come in and take my place,
guy comes behind you.
I'm going to stay and fight and improve my workplace for myself and my coworkers and anyone who comes in that door after me. Like, that is a noble thing. That is a beautiful thing. If we have to fight for something, why not that, I say. And I think that where I get energy and sort of inspiration in a world that doesn't give me a whole lot of it, I get it from that. I get it from working people who stand
Okay.
up and say, I am not as worthless as this system tells me I am. I am worth more. I deserve more. And in fact, I do have rights, and I'm going to exercise them, and I'm going to work together with my coworkers to make this place better, instead of just getting kicked out and being treated like just another warm body who doesn't have a life attached to it.
So let me do a couple things. Good. One, I got to do a little bit of business if I could. Right, guys, if you like what you're hearing, then support my sponsors. My sponsors are theadvocates.org. Take the world's smallest political quiz, figure out where you sit on that list, and then share it. Take it, share it. You might be more progressive, you might be more conservative, you might be more libertarian, you might be more authoritarian. Odds are you're moderate. Most people are, but you might not be. You might be something else. Take the test, send it to the people, let people see it. They're my sponsor. Support me, and it's free. Just do that. It does matter. And of course, I'm always asking you to like and comment and share. If you like what Maximillian's talking about, follow him, therealnews.com. Check out his website, or head over to Twitter, Maximillian_ALV. If you are listening to this, that's Maximillian with 2 L's, not one. Don't mess it up. Maximillian_AVL to follow him. If you want to support the show directly, head over to patreon.com/Sharpway. Throw me $10 a month. If you got tons of money, if you're one of those elitists that everyone's trying to get rid of, give me $100 a month. You got the money. You got the money. Go do that. It's all good. But support us to the best you can so we can keep this going. It does matter. But to your point that you just talked about before, if the answer is I can leave, don't I want to be very open for people to become freelancers and contractors? And I feel like in the most unionized states, New York and California, they're doing the opposite. I feel like they're trying to basically force people, not with force, but with the environment, into being workers and not being owners of their own labor. I feel like it's almost anti-socialist in a way. It's almost forcing people into a world to where they have to become wage laborers. And my bigger issue is, this is also to your point too, maybe it's time that we should be walking away from the per hour paradigm of work. Because if it's a per hour, if I'm paying you $8 per hour, $80 per hour, $800 per hour, where that number is, then I want as much out of you per minute as I can, because I'm paying you for that. But if I'm not saying I need $80 an hour, $8 an hour, I'm saying get this thing done by this time, and that's it. And here's the amount of money you get for it. Is that a better way? Or I'm going to give you a cut of something, or you're going to get a percentage or a bonus, which is what most freelancers work on, that type, either bonus, percentage, flat fee. Most freelancers do that. Shouldn't we be encouraging that?
Again, a very, very interesting question, which kind of depends on, the historical arc of what we're talking about here, right? You mentioned earlier, right, the sort of zero-sum game of industrial, like, let's just take manufacturing, industrial manufacturing. There's only so many things that are going to be manufactured industrially, right? There's still a lot that are produced around the world. But there's automation. There are ways that operations are streamlined, so on and so forth. Right? Those jobs aren't going to always be around forever. So, what do working people do? Do we just fight over each other as those jobs dwindle? Do we hope that some other industry emerges that will provide the same level of job security, pay, healthcare, yada yada? Like we're constantly on shifting ground, and we are constantly playing a losing game. And so a question like yours enters that conversation at a very interesting point of like, well, what if we had, I don't know, a universal basic income, right? What if again, healthcare was a human right and that wasn't a line item on people's monthly budgets that they have to be terrified over? What if housing was a human right and the threat of being out on the street wasn't such a coercive force to keep you locked into a job that treated you so poorly, right? These are questions that sadly a lot of working people in this country and around the world don't have the luxury of asking. We just have to put up and deal with it. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I think if you find a libertarian answer for the UBI is the negative income tax, right? Which is where there's a flat minimum that any individual is supposed to get to survive. And as they make more money, they lose part of their monthly stipend to pop it up to double of that number, right? I don't know have you heard of negative income tax before? Most libertarians are going to scream at UBI. But are we open to a negative income tax? I think many of us are. I'm one of them, open to the idea of a negative income tax that would assist people in moving forward, in helping out people like, working single moms, people who come out of the prison system, right? Helping people out, something like that. I think we'd be open to that idea. But my other idea is I want more people to have ownership of their own life. I want more people to be able to own homes. I want more people to be able to own their jobs. I want more people to have ownership of what they want and in their life. I feel like, coming from where I came from, the Bronx, the immigrant community that we saw all wanted to own something, whether it was owning a car or owning a house or owning a business. They all wanted to own something. And I think that was a thing that was very important to us. So that's why I push on the freelancer piece, right? Because that becomes an ownership in your own future, that kind of thing. That's why I push to that piece. I feel like if I push people back into working for people, I'm almost taking away the ownership. And now if I'm a freelancer, if I've been out on my own, and this is from my own personal experience, again, no data on this, just my gut, I could be wrong. But people who've left the hour wage world, became freelancers and or business owners, when they head back into that world, man, they negotiate well. Like, they get their value. You said a very important thing. Am I more valuable than just a warm body? I feel like when you start putting, whatever, at New York State, I think our minimum wage now is $13.50, I think, in New York City, and like 12 something outside of the city, something like that. When you put that at $13.50 or whatever the number is, I mean, that's my value. My value is $13.50 an hour, or whatever is what I've negotiated with. I feel like we're actually reinforcing the negativity by keeping to that dollar per hour wage, where I'm saying literally anyone who could show up gets $13.50, right? That's like what you're worth. Am I wrong on this?
Oh man. Okay. There's so much to unpack here. Because when it comes to the wage question, I mean, I think that I'm going to do the annoying leftist thing and challenge the premise of the question, right?
Please, go ahead. Go.
Which is that, like, I think it was wrong from the beginning to convince ourselves that what we are paid for the labor that we do is indicative of the value that work produces. As I think we have shown, and I mentioned earlier, right? If that's the case, then how come working people have been working longer, harder, and more, and generating astronomical profits over the past 40 years, and yet have seen none of that? Because we keep subscribing to this fiction that, well, they're just doing a job that, is circumscribed and like, this is all they have to do. This is all it's worth. That's all I have to pay them. The amount of value that I generate for my company, that is not taken into account. Right. That is.
But hold on. I'll give you what pricing is all about, and whether that's pricing of labor or pricing of a car, pricing of anything. It's always the same thing: perceived scarcity, not actual scarcity. Perceived scarcity. If I believe anyone can do this job, whether that's true or not, if I believe anyone can do this job, I'm not going to pay much for it because I think anyone can do it. That is what I believe. And to your point, if the world believes that too, we will act accordingly. If the labor force believes, what are you guys paying? Are you guys hiring? What are you guys paying? If that's the way the labor looks at it, then aren't they going to agree with that? Versus saying, to your point, what's my value here? What value am I bringing to this company? What value am I bringing to the entrepreneur? Wouldn't that change my mindset?
Depends, right? I mean, because, like, again, I think that it's a very different conversation that we're having. Yeah. And in fact, the grounds for that conversation are changed if a person is forced to accept because they're economically coerced
Yeah.
into a lower paying
Good point.
job than they're worth because they need to keep a roof over their head, right? Or because, they got to pay for their, car insurance, stuff like that. So that, then you get into the other side of it, which is like, it's not actually about the value of my labor. It's how close to homelessness and prison can we keep
Mm,
everybody so that they will accept
good
subpar
point.
treatment or subpar payment. But like there are a lot of different scenarios that we could talk about in that regard, but I want to go to the freelancer piece,
Yeah, please.
because I think it's a really interesting question that I speak about as someone who's done a lot of freelancing. I got
Hmm.
my career in the media world by starting as a freelance writer, right?
Yep.
And so I'm very sympathetic to people who want to do that work and be independent. I will say that how we define independence really matters here, because in a lot of ways you're actually not all that independent as a freelancer. You're still dependent on magazines. Like, again, I'm speaking from my own experience. Sometimes people don't pay you. Sometimes you got to hound them for months to get paid.
I know.
Sometimes they're not transparent about what their rates are going to be. Sometimes your piece will get spiked without an explanation, right? I mean, so there actually are still a lot of ways where you're not actually all that independent. And that
Sure.
applies to gig workers as well. This is what every gig worker I've interviewed, including one in the book. I talked to Willie Solis, an incredible worker organizer who works at Shipped in
Hmm.
Texas. And he talks about in the book his experience organizing Shipped shoppers during the pandemic, because Shipped, without, again, like Uber, like Lyft, like DoorDash and Postmates, like every gig company in existence, the promise to people like Willie and others is that you get to be your own boss, you get to make your own hours, you get to have that degree of independence that you do not have as a wage worker, working for a
Hmm.
boss, yada, yada, yada. Obviously that's very attractive to people. A lot of people flooded into the gig economy because that was such an attractive prospect,
Sure.
and people have
Absolutely.
very good reasons for wanting that. I don't berate anyone for wanting that thing. Who doesn't want to make their own hours and be their own boss and so on and so forth? Sadly, what we have realized with so much gig work is that you do have a boss. It's an algorithm that you have that does not listen to you, that you have no say over. And what Willie talks about in my book, The Work of Living, is he says, like, Shipped changed its algorithm that
Yeah.
determines like how much you get paid for this or that delivery, and what the kind of factors are that calculate your customer rating. All that stuff is behind a black box. It's proprietary information. The public does not get to see it. Workers don't get to see it. But when you make changes to that algorithm, workers start noticing that their take-home pay is going down at the end of the week,
Right.
even though they were told by Ship that it would actually go up. And in fact, it didn't, right? So what do you do in that situation? First, you realize, oh, I've been lied to. I actually do still have a boss. I have an app on my phone that is
Right.
that is tracking every mile that I drive, that is penalizing me for taking a route that I know to be quicker, but that the map says I shouldn't take, right? Or maybe I'm stuck in a grocery store around Christmas time, the line's super long. I don't have any control over that. This is the store the app told me to go to. But if my time lags on, I'm the one who takes the customer, or my ratings hit. And that could lead to me getting kicked off the app. And that could lead to
Sure.
me no longer
Sure.
being able to pay my bills. So, like, the fiction of independence that the gig economy promised us, I think more and more people have been realizing that it is a fiction in and of itself. And in what was so sinister in my home state of California, which Willie also talks about in the book, is the Prop 22 campaign, which was bankrolled by the gig companies like DoorDash and Postmates. It was the most expensive ballot measure in California state history. These gig companies in Silicon Valley had an almost endless war chest that they
Hmm.
dumped into a PR campaign to lie to the public about what Prop 22 was going to be, because they were throwing a hissy fit after the state legislature pushed through AB 5, which was going to grant more rights to gig workers, so on and so forth. We'll talk about this in a second, because the freelancer question came up in that debate. And so when the gig companies had lost through the legislative process, the supposed democratic process, They flipped over the chessboard. They went and put it on a ballot measure. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to lie to the public to get them to vote. And they made it so that if this was voted in, it was almost impossible to repeal it. So they effectively lied and spent their way into duping the public to bend labor law to fit their exploitative business model and enshrine a third class of worker who could legally be paid under minimum wage. And that's what we've seen when Prop 22 started to be implemented. Now, a judge actually ruled it unconstitutional, and now it's in this big back and forth debate. But to your point, legitimate freelancers were raising the question during AB 5 and during the Prop 22 thing, was like, I don't want to be an employee. Do I have a say in any of this?
But there's two pieces here I want to bring up. Number one is, this, in my view, is government acting too fast. Government stepping in and trying to protect the gig worker when it shouldn't. The gig worker, in my view, should create the equivalent of a union for gig workers, a guild or whatever the thing is, right?
But they can't, because of the way that this industry is set up. They are legally not allowed to. I agree with you. If they could, that would be great.
Government getting back in the way again, right? I think it could absolutely work. I think it could. But besides the point, I think we should be encouraging, for many libertarians are 100% against unions. I'm not. I think unions, in my view, are the First Amendment. They are the freedom of speech and freedom of association together. So I see unions, in my view, are American, are important and valuable. It's one reason why I'm having you on the show to talk to you about it. A lot of my libertarian audience is like, why is this guy on the show? Because I think unions are valuable and they're important. I am worried on several things about them, though. I'm worried that often they're forced. Public unions are very often ineffective in how they actually support the actual taxpayers. I worry that they are corrupt and support one party or another, like there's no tomorrow, and act as the equivalent of PACs for certain candidates. So I have lots of issues with them. But Alexander brings up something that I was concerned about. Alexander says he disagrees with you on what Act 10 did to Wisconsin public schools. He says he has looked it up, and Wisconsin's ranked number 8 in public school rankings. Going after teachers unions doesn't look like it was that bad. Now, I don't know how accurate it is. I'm just thinking what he put up. I'm in New York, and we rank anywhere from 35th to 44th. And we're the most unionized in the entire state. So which is why so many people in New York, like Alexander, are against the unions, because we have not seen unions do well in our state. Our education is always ranked in the bottom 25, if not the bottom 10, in almost every way, shape, and form. And we are heavily unionized. So I think that's the pushback you're going to get from states like ours when it comes to the governor trashing the public union. Most of New Yorkers are going to be like, because of our experience. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense. I mean, like, we're talking about a country with hundreds of millions of people in it. And, it's a big country. I always tell people this is like, we shouldn't be surprised that it's a big country with a complex population. There's never going to be one size fits all solutions, right? But what I do know is that what I see around this country is a society that are the results of a society in which decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of a few, right? And those few tend to be the ones who are making out like bandits. Like, this is the other thing that I would say, whether we're talking about public sector workers as being like, overpaid, the administrative bloat. I agree with you on that. Like, this is another problem. I mean, David Graeber famously called these bullshit jobs. Now, I'm not saying every administrator has a bullshit job. There's a great,
of course not.
There's a great tweet from a writer I love, Ed Bramilla, that said, at any university, there's a dusty office in the basement where a woman named Peggy essentially keeps the entire operation running, right? There are people who are essential to a bureaucracy, but what we have seen in so many different industries, including education, is this kind of bloat of, middle layer administrators and very overly paid, like administrators at the top. That is a significant problem. And it's something that I remember talking a lot about and writing a lot about when I was focusing on the political economy of higher education. Right now, the largest strike in the country is happening at the University of California. Across the statewide system, 48,000 academic workers are on the picket line right now in New York, where y'all are.
Wow.
The new school, part-time faculty
Yep.
are on strike. The new school is a great institution. It's held up as a progressive institution, and yet 87% of the teaching done at that university are done by part-time faculty who have to
professors.
yeah,
Yep.
adjuncts like who are
Yep.
also struggling to live in the city, who can get
Absolutely.
kicked off their health care like that. There's so many ways
True.
that the people who actually make these universities run and who provide the service that we think universities are there to provide are the ones who have been, like squashed and adjunctified to hell, while like the endowments of these universities keep exploding, while the salaries and bonuses of the presidents and upper echelon administrators keeps going up. So you kind of have a mirrored problem to what you're seeing in like corporate America, right?
Mhm.
Which is that,
Sure.
and the reason I brought that up is like when we talk about public sector employees and like what they're doing to the tax base, the elephant in the room is that there is a very clear class of people and entities, namely corporations, that are ripping all of us off by
100%.
magnitudes more than any public sector worker or union across the state is
It's
doing.
true.
So like that is what Walker's Act 10 was also there to do. It was there to, take a once progressive state where a lot of our modern day labor movement was born. AFSCME started in Wisconsin, right? I mean, like it has such a rich political history, and now it's a right to work state, right? Now the public sector worker unions have been gutted, while Walker essentially, managed to divert everyone's attention to the public sector unions and not to all of the major tax breaks that corporations were going to get in the state. And he was not going to ask people to tally up how much more they were losing to the coffers of the corporations that Walker was trying to incentivize to operate in the state versus like what was going to the healthcare of some 8th grade teacher in Appleton, right? And so I guess I would just say we're gonna disagree on a lot of these things, but we're also like, if we're not talking about the people who are siphoning off the biggest amount of wealth from our society, there's no sufficient answer, because all of us are getting screwed over by the same people. And in fact,
you're not going to have any argument for me on that one.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the ruling class is at least doing us a favor, because the smaller they get and the richer they get, the easier it is to see, oh, those are the people who are screwing. They're making themselves an easier target, but at the same time, they're making it harder for us to actually do anything about it, which is why we have to do it in numbers and why we have to work together to address these problems. And I hope that the conversation that we've had over the last hour and a half at least provides fodder for what conversations we should be having.
I think so. Cameron says our society is a much better place with Max and Larry. Keep up the good work, gentlemen. So someone's enjoying it. So I guess somebody is. That's for sure. Absolutely. So yeah, I do think that we do agree that there are issues that we have to work on, right? That's for sure. I think that's a big deal. I'm not sure. I think my gut goes to the Janus decision, in my view, was a good decision, that people shouldn't be forced to join a union. I like the idea of us breaking ourselves up into multiple unions, which hasn't happened. But I was hoping that was going to happen. Multiple ways of people getting together. The idea of guilds for people who are, more freelance workers. I don't think that's happened, though, which is disappointing for me. I wanted it to be more decentralized. I think decentralized unions are the way that we can actually make things work. I think the large, huge unions that, to your point, they become bloated. They become the big guys see that thing on the top. They start giving money to politicians. That has been my worry. And I feel like unions haven't gone where I want them to go, if that makes any sense. I hope one day they will. Am I making sense of what I'm saying? I'm not sure if I am.
I think you are. I mean, again, I would just, underline, what I said before is that whether we're talking about, unions as such, the labor movement, because a lot of people ask me, they say, like, where is this all going? And I say, you
Yeah.
tell me. You tell me, because what happens next largely depends on what we do now, right? I mean, like, because it's not something that's happening elsewhere. It is happening around us. You know, people who are involved in this struggle. You yourself are maybe impacted by it. The
Mhm.
question is, do you see yourself as an agent of history? Do you see yourself as someone who participates in shaping the world that we all inhabit? Or are we just, as Kurt Vonnegut would say, the listless playthings of enormous forces? I don't think that we are. I think that there are examples of people all around us who are taking their lives and taking the charge to change their circumstances into their own hands. And we should support them as much as possible if we want to see the kind of change that we think needs to happen in this country. Again, just I wanted to end by kind of really shouting people out.
Mhm.
1,000 coal miners in Deep Red, Alabama, represented by the United Mine Workers of America, just crossed their 600th day on strike at
And
Warrior Met
almost no
Coal.
one's talking about it.
No one's talking about it. I had to watch, as a conservative, every year. I watched, Fox News go, like, a politician go to coal country and talk to a coal covered coal miner and talk about how they actually cared about the humble coal miner. These mine workers have been on strike for almost 2 years now, and right-wing media hasn't said shit. They have abandoned these workers because they're in a union, and that is not right. At the same time, as I said, 48,000 workers at the University of California are on strike, and workers at Case New Holland Industrial in Racine, Wisconsin, and in Burlington, Iowa, another major farming equipment manufacturer like John Deere, but they've gotten significantly less media attention. I just published an interview with a worker from Burlington on my podcast, Working People. They are heading into the holidays. The company is trying to wait them out, hoping that as it gets colder on the picket line, as the bills pile up and the holidays approach and people are worried about whether or not they're going to buy presents for their kids, the company is hoping that that added pressure will coerce workers into taking a deal that they shouldn't take, right? So we can't forget about them. And I mentioned Starbucks, right? You may think that Starbucks workers aren't real workers, that they don't deserve union representation, that it's just service industry work that's only meant for like 16 and 17-year-olds.
I
You are
hope people
living.
don't believe that.
A lot of people do. It's sad. I hear people say this to me all the
Okay.
time. They're like, "Oh, well, those are meant for high school students anyway," right? Like, that's just such a wrong-headed way to view it. Martin Luther King famously said, "All labor has dignity," right? It doesn't matter how long you're at your job. That doesn't make it okay for your boss to exploit you. That doesn't make it okay for you to be underscheduled, to be harassed, to be intimidated and surveilled by your managers, which is what Starbucks workers across the country are going through right now. Starbucks is launching a scorched earth campaign, violating flagrantly workers' rights in public view. They just closed the first unionized Starbucks in Seattle this week. They closed stores that have also unionized, like in Ithaca, New York, after they voted to unionize. I mean, like, it is happening in front of our faces. Everyone knows it. And the sad thing, like I said earlier, is that it may be working, because this year has been great for the organized labor movement, right? The amount of union petitions filed is over that of last year by like 50%.
Sure.
And the number of union election victories is up, is way up from last year as well. But another concerning trend, right? When the Starbucks union wave really kicked off this time last year, after the workers in Buffalo became the first store in the country to vote to unionize, you saw this explosion of union election filings across the country, right? As the year has gone on, and as Starbucks has turned the screws and made life worse and illegally retaliated against workers for engaging in concerted protected activity, which under the National Labor Relations Act, it is illegal for a boss to retaliate against you
Sure.
for organizing. But that doesn't matter to Starbucks. They're still intimidating people, firing people, underscheduling people, kicking them off their health care because of it, closing unionized stores. And it's working because the number of union election filings at Starbucks has gone
don't think
down.
you're going to get many people to particularly the libertarians to fight on the private sector issue. What you're going to keep hearing us complain about is public sector, right? You're going to hear us complain about always. But here's something good. We'll give you something nice to talk about here. This conversation shows if people would turn off their partisan cable news and actually talk to the neighbor on the other side of the spectrum, you'll probably find that you don't disagree nearly as much as you think you do. That's a nice thing that Dan says.
Amen,
But
Dan.
Dan also says, John Alcliffe in his book Quitter warned that when you quit your wage earning job, you trade one boss for several bosses. This is your point. Your direct boss is the gas company, electric company, your internet provider, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's also true. Some other good things I think you'll hear us, or you'll hear many people get upset about, and I think they're right on this one, is Brian says administrative bloat is due to government interference. They need to ensure compliance with government regulations. And I agree with that, right? I think the more we try to regulate instead of letting unions regulate, I think you're double regulating, which means now you're double adminning. I do see that as an issue. I don't know if you agree with that or not. That's one of my concerns. I don't like the double regulation. I think one is enough.
In principle, I agree with that. I mean, I think it will really depend on the industry that you're looking at. You know, I mentioned the demolition workers in New York City. One of the reasons that the union is such an attractive job is not just, because they pay better, but because they take better care of their workers, right? They have multiple people on a job site making sure that everything is being done up to code because they want to see everyone go home at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
At non-union workplaces like Alba Demolition, that's not happening, right?
Yes.
And so,
but what you're saying though, again, I'm talking more of an image that matters to me, because if people, to your point of the PR campaign in California, right? If people don't believe it or see it, they're not going to vote for it, right? And the image that I think, again, Dan brings this up. He says, only comment, when unions like the teachers union protect their worst members, I will judge them by their worst member. He's about the police also. As you know, libertarians are not happy with police unions, obviously. They should police their own. So I think that's an image that people see constantly. The image that, well, there's no accountability, if that makes any sense, right? Kenneth goes on to say the accountability of unions, especially public sector, you keep hearing public sector, as you probably noticed, is lacking, which exacerbate the larger the unions get. So I guess the biggest pushback I think most of the audience will give you is in the public sector piece. And I think they have a valid point in bloat, which is taxpayer dollars, accountability, and the image that if you're a bad worker, 90% of the union affect the bad worker and don't help the good worker. And as I've done some work training New York City agencies, and they're all unionized. And I hear consistently people say, I'm a good worker and I get ignored. I'm paying all my dues. And then the guy who's a jerk, they spend all their time helping that guy out. And then when I say, hey, I have a problem, I can't get a return email. I think that's a common issue. I think you'll find the biggest pushback. I feel like we kind of agree on this, don't we?
That's helpful. No, I mean, it's helping me sort of see, and how I may have approached the conversation differently if we started over, but having that distinction makes a little more sense. And I get where it's coming from, because again, I grew up in this, and people in my own family feel this way. Like my brother Jesse, incredibly hard worker. He was the first one of me and my siblings to have a union job, and he hated it for that exact reason, because he worked really hard. He did not get recognized for it, and he felt like he was being wronged by the seniority system that meant that the asshole who wasn't working as hard above him, was getting, promoted when he wasn't. And of course, and if you're in that situation, that's not going to seem fair. Right. And in fact, it may not be fair. I'm willing to concede it's probably not fair in all of these cases. I guess the perspective that I have gained as I've made my long trek from deep conservative to lefty nut job, right, is that even the bad apples in that case, like, again, I would rather have that problem of unions that overprotect people who probably, should be disciplined more or talked to more, or, if they are assholes, they should be fired, right? I've talked to a lot of union workers who say that as well. So it's not something that the labor movement is staunchly opposed to. A lot of people say, if there's a guy on our, shop floor who's endangering other people by not following protocol, we don't want him there, right? So, it's not us versus them, right? There are a lot of nuances here, but what I would say is, for all the problems with unions, I would rather have those problems than not have unions, because I have seen what, the powers that be want to do to us as a working class if we have no protection whatsoever, which is what Bernie Sanders famously called a race to the bottom. That's what I want to avoid. I'm not saying we're not going to have disagreements and problems along the way, but those are problems worth having than the problem of, oh crap, no one owns their house anymore, right? There's no minimum wage anymore, right? I mean, like, we're like, our problems could be a lot worse if we didn't even have the protections, insufficient as they are, that we have today. The only other thing that I would say about the private public distinction, which I would just more pose as a question to folks, maybe we can come back and talk about it in another session, but I think actually there is a case to be made here for that democratic impulse, for the need to have a democratic say. The reason that we feel more strongly about public sector unions is because we feel like we have a stake in what they do, because we feel like our tax dollars are actually paying for them and what they do, right? So we are in effect stakeholders of public sector employees.
You have literally just given me a new policy idea.
Okay.
You've literally just given me a new policy idea.
But like, you know, in
Yes.
a sense, that's a good thing that people are actually invested in how that works.
No, but it's an actual solution where I don't have to break up a union to get change, right? You've just given me an idea that we could create at a state level that I don't have to break up a union and I can still get change. And that people who are voters and that people who are union members who are also voters would all get a say in change in the union. Now, I haven't fleshed it. Just kidding me now. You'll see on my website, I'll have a policy on this in a couple of months. But I will have a policy on this. It's not a bad idea. You just give me thank you. This was totally worth it. Thank you.
I mean, and with the private sector, right? It's because again, we see these Starbucks workers going up against Howard Schultz and the world's largest coffee chain. They are on their own, right? And so it's very much like, yeah, I want you guys to win. I don't have a dog in this fight because it's you versus this Goliath private corporation. The lines are a little clearer there. Now they're more muddled in the public sector. That doesn't mean they're not there. Of course, we talked about the 80s. A lot of what we've been talking about famously kind of kicked off when Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers who were public sector workers, right? So there are distinctions here. I was also in Wisconsin when I was doing that reporting to report on one of the most infamous teacher strikes in the state's history in Hortonville in 1974, right? And that was an instance where the local school board, in fact, fired everyone who was striking. It was a very contentious strike. It left a deep scar on the community, right? So you do have still sort of like battle lines drawn there, but I do think that the reason, I think we should focus less on, I would just leave people with this thought experiment. I'm not going to propose anything, but just sit with everything that we've talked about over the past hour and a half and think about it from that side, right? It's like, I care about this more because I feel I have a stake in it, right? Versus like, I'm an outside observer who doesn't like that this union is protecting a shitty teacher who should be fired, right? If we just put ourselves in that different frame, like, how do we then, as stakeholders in the future, who believe that workers do have rights, that people should live like dignified lives, right? That people should be held accountable for 100%. Wrongdoing, right? But that, you know, that ultimately, if we believe in the thriving of working people who deserve a good life, which I think that we all do, then if we sit and think of ourselves as stakeholders in a public sector, how does that, what happens now? What conversations can we have that don't pit us worker against worker? Maybe then we can get
I love the idea.
productive.
And here's what I'm telling my audience. Within 2 months, you will see a new policy on LarrySharpe.com that will cover this. And I will even give you credit, Maximillian. I will give you credit for on top of it. Not that you'll care, but you'll get it anyway. So thank you for coming today, Maximillian. I really appreciate the time you gave me. You gave my audience an amazing show. Everybody for watching, thank you so much. Please like, comment, and share. It does matter. Let people know that this is happening. And follow Maximillian on Twitter, Maximillian_ALV, and that's Maximillian with 2 L's. Don't mess it up if you're listening, or head over to therealnews.com, and that's real, REAL, therealnews.com to follow him. I was going to say thank you so much for hanging out with me this evening. Happy Turkey Day to everybody. Tomorrow, I will not be on tomorrow, but I might be on Friday. I will see you all